My name is Lev Grossman. I wrote the Magician's books. I worked for Time magazine for a long time. And this is William Gibson. And we are here to talk about, well, whatever we like, but we're definitely going to touch on Agency, which is Bill's new book. I thought maybe we could start by talking about, we need to talk about the universe, the multiverse in which this book unfolds, so that everybody knows what the ground rules are. I don't know. Mentally, I refer to this world as the periphery after the peripheral, but you probably have a name for it. Do you have a name for this?
Well, I think of it as the stubs, because the stubs are what people in the 22nd century London call alternate timelines, that they're somehow able, mysteriously, it's not yet been explained, they're able to create by sending emails to the past. And when an email is received in their past, its reception instantly splits off into another timeline, which is moving forward. And the timelines are synchronized in a way that I could explain if I could read a passage from the book aloud, but otherwise it's too complicated. But there is no, excuse me, in these books, they're like physical time travel is an impossibility. But digital communication is a possibility. And these days, given the technology we have even today, digital communication can, physically put you there in a device, and you can experience, you can experience things as though you were there. I mean, we're almost there. We have what the people in the peripheral call wheelie boys, like the iPad on the Segway. And you can control an iPad on a Segway in the reality that your email has split off from your own past.
Whenever you have a new book coming out, it's particularly the start of a new trilogy, I'm always insanely curious to know: are you going to be in the sort of the medium to far future, or the near future, or a facsimile of the present? And I was wrong-footed, as I usually am, when it turned out that you were going to work in these sort of in this kind of split timeline between more or less the present and. I can't remember the exact year, but it's sort of 150 years or so in the future. I'm curious what attracted you to that setup. You have sort of two timelines, two milieux connected by this very narrow umbilical of information connecting them. What interested you as a writer about that setup?
Well, I've always been drawn to time travel stories, and simultaneously equally repelled by all that tedious paradox business. And I wanted something, when I was getting the peripheral going, I had one protagonist's very near future small town America up and running, and I was really satisfied with this, and I knew that I was going to want another sort of seat of power somewhere. And initially I thought it would just be like a near future Miami or greater Atlanta or something, in contrast to this this small town. But then I remembered a story by Louis Scheiner and Bruce Sterling called Mozart in Mirror Shades that just elegantly dispenses with all of the paradox business in time travel stories by saying that you go in that story, they go back physically. They're going back to do like grotesque resource extractions, like deforesting all of 19th century Germany, and sending it back through the time portal. But it doesn't affect. They had that mechanism that I described earlier, which I totally owe to Sterling and Scheiner, that the rule is it just splits off and goes forward on its own. They never touch, and whatever you do in that split or stub, as they call them in the peripheral, can't affect anything that's happening in your present. But it occurred to me, once I thought of that, it occurred to me that I could make it purely digital, and I could use very, very advanced forms of technology to allow people from the future further in the past to actually visit the future in the far future, and vice versa, via sort of cyborg bodies controlled digitally, and I think that all came together over the course of about 48 hours, and I went on from there.
I wonder if you could just introduce two of the main characters of Agency. Some of them roll over from the peripheral, like Wilf Netherton, but a lot of the action revolves around two entities, Verity Jane and Eunice. And I don't know how much you want to say in advance about what happens in the book, but could you just sort of introduce us to Verity Jane and Eunice and say a little about who they are?
Well, Verity Jane this is kind of a familiar template for characters for me, and I was fully conscious of that when I came up with her. She's a Silicon Valley specialist with a reputation for doing this particular thing doing the thing she does better than anyone else can do, to the extent that Wired magazine calls her the app whisperer. You give her your alpha, the alpha of your app, and she lives with it and uses it, and then tells you what really sucks about it and what's good. And if it's something that involves artificial intelligence, as in this case, then naturally she communicates with it. And she's been out of work for a year because she had an affair with an eccentric young Silicon Valley billionaire, venture capitalist guy. And it wasn't much of an affair, and it didn't last very long. But he had so much media attention that when she got out of it, the media attention followed her. And so she's had like a nasty year of essentially hiding in San Francisco. She hasn't worked. She's really low on money. She's rented her condo to two executives, I think, from Uber. And then she's offered a gig testing what's presented to her as a new personal assistant app. And that turns out to be this entity who calls herself Eunice, and seems to be African American and female in her and declares herself to be African American and female. And so they try to once they're together, it becomes immediately apparent to Verity that Eunice is like some strange business. And for instance, that she has a remarkable command of strategy. And, she shortly turns out to be a piece of purloined Pentagon military software that someone has stolen and is trying to turn into a product. But you realize, while you're getting that, you realize that you're in a world where the Brexit referendum went no, and Hillary Clinton was elected president. And then you find yourself in the other frame, and so it goes from there.
One of the things, I'm not done with Eunice, but sidebar, one of the things that interests me about going that way, going the Hillary way and the no Brexit way, is that it's not some kind of liberal paradise, best case scenario. As it turns out, all of our problems don't go away.
No, not at all. But it's also a world in which the opposite outcome just seems ridiculous. If anybody even suggests that might have happened, they go, no way. Are you crazy? That's just like, no, couldn't have happened. So it isn't that they don't feel as though they've had a close shave.
One of the things I want to come back to about Eunice is you skip a lot of the kind of primary tropes of AI fiction. There is usually a lot of kind of hand-wringing of the Velveteen Rabbit variety, like, am I a real person? Is this entity a real person? Does it have feelings? How could it acquire human feelings? Eunice just seems to be herself and not crippled by that kind of self-doubt, nor is anybody around her confused about whether she is a fully sentient entity.
Well, I think we might actually, in real life, I think we might be past the hand-wringing point. We aren't past the no shit point, which characters in the book express. But because Eunice is consistent in her character and extremely dynamic in terms of making things happen, I think the characters are not unrealistically forced to accept her as the narrative moves, rather quickly along.
Another thing that does not happen in agency, or it's not immediately apparent to me, is the singularity does not occur. I've always been attached to that a piece of singularity lore, the idea that the first truly artificially intelligent entity we create is the last invention that humanity will ever have to produce. But she does not trigger an immediate awakening of all machines. There's no Skynet, and there isn't there isn't an instant utopia either. Does that idea of the singularity interest you at all? Does it just seem hopelessly implausible?
Oh, I think that Werner Vinge's initial concept of it is a very interesting concept, but the mythology, the mythos that has been built around it since has never impressed me very much. And as far back as All Tomorrow's Parties, I was writing a book which ended with what I don't call it this in the book, but I thought about when I'm writing it. It's a half-assed singularity. Like it's not absolute, and it changes a whole lot of things, but it doesn't change everything. And I think that may be because my experience in life and my experience as a reader of history is that the really bad shit arrives when, so you know, the bad shit's starting to arrive when somebody tells you something they believe is absolute, and it's going to change everything, and particularly if they tell you it's going to change it all for the better. So this is another, half-assed singularity, and I very much enjoyed that aspect of it, because this story, there's a lot of opportunities to see how it doesn't transcend everything. Really, it seems to me that our world and our species and the universe and all of that is an amazingly raggedy-ass construct. And biologists, friends of mine, have said to me, the more I learn about how life works, the more amazed I am that it even can. So I'm suspicious, and that's why I'm suspicious of that idea of something we build will suddenly go beep and be the most important thing in the universe forever, and in some way that we are, by definition, unable to imagine now. And I can't help but imagine it as being as random and fucked up as the rest of history.
That said, if there isn't a singularity, there is an apocalypse in this book. There was an apocalypse in the peripheral, and it's still going to happen / has happened in Agency. Can we talk about the jackpot for a minute, because it is I find it a very fascinating take on the apocalypse. It is. Is that fair to say that it's an apocalyptic event or sequence?
Well, the reason it's difficult, something that makes it difficult to discuss, and the phrasing of your question touches on that. And I think that, as far as I can, I've been looking and asking people to direct me to a human culture that had an apocalypse, an apocalypse, a final event that took about 200 years or more. And I just don't think we have it. I think the reason we don't have it is that that's longer than our lifespans. We've never been able to get our head around around that stuff. So you go to the Bible, and the end of the world, it's going to be over a relatively short period of time. And all the language we have, the day of reckoning, all these things. And every apocalypse we've ever imagined has been very brief. There's never been a guy who went out and stood on the sidewalk in a white robe with holding up a sign that says, the world is going to end in about 200 years. And if there had been, he would never have gotten any followers. We're just not culturally wired for it. But now, you know, in the real world, in the opinion of serious science, that's what we're facing. You know, we're facing an apocalypse that could take 200 years, 100 years, and is well on its, you know, it's on its way to happening. You know, it's probably already happening, and we know that. So in agency, there's that, which is a big factor. That concept is a big factor in the peripheral, but in agency, there's also an equivalent in one of the stubs. There's a contemporary equivalent to the Cuban Missile Crisis underway throughout the book. And that was the apocalypse of my childhood. And I know perfectly well how to write about it. I grew up watching Twilight Zone episodes that took it for granted. And that stayed with us up until right around the time I was writing Neuromancer. That was our expected apocalypse. So now we've got this new one, and we don't have cultural tools. And I think this is a significant fact. We're facing this new kind of apocalypse, and we don't have the cultural tools to address it with or name it properly. So I decided to just call it the jackpot, lowercase. And it's like all that shit that you've been hearing about all your life just happening, like over the next 70, 80 years or so, all of it. And all of it, in any case, all of it that seems at all likely to happen now, and a lot of it seems more likely to happen now because of climate change. Like we're more likely to see pandemics because of climate change, for instance. A lot of it. But it's a long thing, and it'll be longer than we'll be alive, I imagine. And what do you do with that? Like, how do you write about it? So a big part of the peripheral for me was finding a way to articulate that and keep writing a book, which I did, and agency comes directly out of that.
Well, you have a terrible knack for naming things, and there are moments when I wonder if the jackpot might even stick as a name. One of the odd things about the jackpot is that humanity sort of clings to existence, and on the other side of it is not a post-apocalyptic dystopia, but actually something that, while not, I wouldn't call it a utopia, is a little bit utopian. I mean, post-jackpot London is a place that I'm not wholly sure that I would mind living.
Well, that's interesting. You're the first person you're the first person I've heard articulate that, but I was conscious of it myself when I was writing it. I would something you might want to consider about the peripheral and that post-jackpot kleptocratic utopia is that there's never any mention of what's happening outside the M25. And the rest of the world that we see in the peripheral is in variously, deeply weird shape. We don't see much of it, but they haven't really, they haven't gotten the technology they need to fix it or really slow climate change down, but they can make the seat of their empire quite comfortable for the nuts.
When you get takeout, the bag that your takeout comes in, you take the food out of it, it then refolds itself into an origami bird and flies back to the place where you got the takeout. That's a future I want to live in.
Well, also, that's part of an impulse I had. I wanted to do a sort of middle-class couple in the post-jackpot utopia. And not, cut away from, like my crypto espionage stuff, and just have this couple with a young child who are, pretty normal people, but they live with this stuff. I think though that they've chosen, sort of as a matter of taste or maybe kind of generational style, they've chosen to have their lives be as much like pre-jackpot lives as is possible. And this, doing that in a world in which, literally any object can suddenly melt and turn back into something else because a swarm of nano constructors have come out of the table, disassembled it, and turned it from a microphone into a triple cheeseburger that you then have for dinner. They live in that world, but they don't want to see that. They want to go out and buy dinner or have dinner delivered. They don't want random things turned into triple cheeseburgers, but that would be possible if it was necessary.
One of the things I love about Agency and the Peripheral is how not just willing, but eager you are to describe some of our micro interactions with technology. When I was reading, I'm reading Agency, and there are descriptions of unboxing, the experience of setting up a device, parsing a new UI, putting the earbuds in, the stuff that so many novelists flee in terror from. I'd like to skip over, I feel like you are deliberately drawn to it, and as a result, I felt like I was reading descriptions of things that I'd never really seen described before, but which are actual everyday experiences for everybody. What interests you about those little interactions, just taking the plastic wrap off and opening the box?
Part of it, I suspect, in some, I hope, subtle way, maybe neurological. It's just something, there's some way in which that's always been with me. Like I'm very interested in objects. And, but my high school career having been interrupted in my late teens, in my early 20s, I found myself going to a reputable diploma mill in Washington, D.C. to finish my high school degree in a year and a half or so. And the writing, I don't know what they call them, composition instructor, writing instructor, was a man named Lawrence G. Perkins, whose name I've always remembered. And he had all his life been a writer of specifications for the U.S. military. And so if the military wanted something, be it, a fighter plane or a pencil, a billion pencils, Mr. Perkins would sit down and write a description of it, which would become part of the binding contract with whichever contractor got the job. And he taught us to write like that. So every assignment was, the ballpoint pen you're using now, describe it. 1,400 words. And I'd take these home, and I loved doing it. I really loved doing it. And then in my later 20s, almost into my 30s, when I was first starting to try to write science fiction, I found that what would get me into it, from blank page to something, would be to describe an imaginary object at that level of specificity. And I think that stayed with me through my career. I mean, I sometimes worry that, it's like a deformity or something, that I should be watching that. And I do try to do it, not try to do it too much, but I think it's a huge part. But I also think it's become a big part of our culture, like unboxing videos, and that's such a thing. And why is it? And why does Apple spend all that time and money and energy making it so exciting to do it? Because it always is. There's that thrill, I find, particularly with Apple, of getting it out of the box. And so they're thinking about that. So it's an odd kind of naturalism for me. Naturalism is the excuse I fall back on for a lot of my peculiarities as a science fiction writer, that I'm trying to provide more than most of the science fiction I grew up reading would provide of naturalism.
Do you use Apple products?
I do. I'm actually, but not in any sophisticated way. I mean, it's entirely possible that I know less about computers and the real digital world than anybody in this room. And I said that at an Electronic Frontier Foundation meeting in San Francisco a couple of weeks ago, and I was like rock solid. It was true. But it hasn't been a problem. I actually think it's often given me some very weird advantages, because instead of using the new product, I watch other people do it. I don't think I've ever been in the an alpha consumer of anything, but I guess I've stayed with Apple because I started with Apple, and I didn't have the sort of interest in the nuts and bolts of computing that I gather kept a lot of people away from Apple initially, and may still do, for all I know.
I want to come back to Eunice, not only because she's so central to the book, but also she throws back in some ways, intentional or unintentional, to Neuromancer, which Time magazine called one of the most influential books of the late 20th century. I wrote that. But it's true. Even though I wrote it, it's true. And I just wonder, I always sense that that you write AIs with a certain relish, and I just wonder how your sense of what AIs are like, your sort of theory of AI, the experience of writing an AI, has it changed? Has it evolved since Neuromancer? Since so much has changed in the actual field of artificial intelligence?
Well, I'm not really one for going back and rereading my earlier work. So I'm more familiar, actually. I'm more conversant with AI in Neuromancer, my first novel, than I am, for instance, of its presentation in Cat Zero and Mona Lisa Overdrive. But from what I recollect, I sort of landed running in, as I was writing Neuromancer, in a couple of different visions of what AI might be like. And then over the course of the two subsequent books, those morphed into a number of other possibilities of what it could be like. Like I never assumed that it would necessarily all become one thing. That there would be different kinds of there would be different kinds of it. So I gave myself permission to present different kinds of it in a universe where the humans seem to take that for granted, and I think that's continued for me. It, insofar as I've written, reasonably far future fiction, there isn't much of it in the so-called bridge books, which were the subsequent so-called trilogy, but then it starts to, and in pattern recognition, which is the beginning of another so-called trilogy, we're sort of too soon to have it, because those are, I thought of those as speculative novels of the very recent past. And with the peripheral, we find ourselves again, I find myself writing about it because at least half the book is set quite far in the future, where I assume, I assume it's quite reasonable to depict artificial intelligences of various kinds, going about their business and no one makes anything of it.
I'm actually an assiduous rereader of your early work, and it's still super good. But I want to ask you about cyberpunk, which has remained a really durable aesthetic, a really durable vision of the future. I still see new work that I would describe as cyberpunk. I'm curious what you make of it and how you feel about it now.
Well, I'm curious about it. I'm curious about it myself, and my current position on it, insofar as I have one, is that when cyberpunk became, actually, I think, a meme, but in the pre-social media sense of the word, that it did so at a time in which it was a speculative fiction. And, you know, speculative fiction imagining a future. Well, fast forward to now, or, you know, sometime in our recent past. And what it's become, I think, is it's actually a retro future. And a retro future is what we're looking at when we look at how the 1920s would have imagined the 1960s. And actually, I think one of my earliest published works of fiction is called The Gernsback Continuum, and it's about a man who's essentially haunted by the retro future of the 1920s and sees it all around him in this funky, naturalistic, decaying real world that he lives in. And so I've seen something go from being a meme of speculative fiction to being a retro future. But in the case of the Gernsback Continuum, like, nobody, you know, nobody was looking out the window in the 1950s and seeing, you know, streamlined silver cars and couples in white togas. But that's what, you know, H.G. Wells' Things to Come, the film, was showing us. So they never got their retro future. With cyberpunk, it's a retro future, and it came true. To whatever extent, you know, to some extent, it came true. And it's just, that in itself is really confusing, I think.
I'm going to open this up to audience questions in just a minute or two. Last couple of questions, which are cheap and low-hanging fruit. I know you can't say very much about the peripheral show that is in development at Amazon, but I also know that everybody is super curious about it. Is there anything you can say at all about the peripheral show?
Well, it appears to still be in development, and I have heard no actual cries of pain from any of the other mere humans who I'm involved with on it. You know, the people who took it, the people who took it to the Westworld people, for instance, and even the Westworld people themselves. There's no cries of pain. So it seems to be going forward, but beyond that, there really isn't much. And it's my first experience of this really emergent industry, and that's why whenever I see you, I ask you those questions.
Are there any questions in the audience? There are some questions. What about in the way back there? Oh, sorry, there's a microphone. There's very bright lights here, so my experience of you guys visually is a little bit hazy. We're going to go to the microphone in a second, but first we'll do the fellow in the green shirt because I pointed to him before.
Yeah. Come on up.
Cut the line.
Step right up, step right up. Hi, I just wanted to get your take on the research that's going on within the Defense Department, the government, companies like Neuralink, compared to, basically it's all brain-computer interface work. And given that you wrote about this 35 years ago, and we're potentially, say 10, 20 years away, max from it becoming a reality, just to get your thoughts on that. First off, in one word, how does it make you feel?
Well, what was the company that you...
One of them is Neuralink. It's actually owned by Elon Musk. I was trying not to say that name.
I can't, I wish I could give you an answer to that, but I've never actually heard of Neuralink. I don't do the anything like the sort of research that a lot of the science fiction writers I met when I first came into the field did. I'm influenced by, probably more by like pop phenomena and social media, and yet, still somehow evidently able to function. But I wish I could help you, but Cory Doctorow could answer that.
Oh, no,
yeah, for sure.
I guess I just look at it from a standpoint of neuromancer, for the most part, coming true.
Well, since I don't actually know what the company does, I can't, I've never heard of that company, but I'm glad I know who owns it now. And so, I can't really help you with that one. I'm sorry.
All right, thank you.
Okay.
First, thanks for coming to Comic-Con. It's great to have you here. I'm wondering, now that artificial intelligence is becoming a lot more prevalent, and some of these devices have actually been asked questions like, do you see yourselves as compatible with humans, or being able to coexist with humans as you grow in power? And some of them have been saying no. What's your opinion about our work, man's work now, with AI and artificial intelligence? What do you think we should be doing along those lines? What opinions would you have for the people that are designing this stuff?
Well, again, that's not really how my imagination works. And that's why I've gone to, the fewest tech conferences in the course of my career, probably of most of the science fiction writers I know. And I'm actually in the process of what I do is not a process of forming opinions. It's a process of finding questions. And what I like to think I'm giving the reader is the basis to come up with their own questions, and they can then ask someone who actually knows. And maybe then eventually in some sort of, great loop of the universe, it'll come back to me and, I'll go, okay, that's, I see that. But that'll be my opinion now. But, I don't analyze the progress of technology. I'm like, it's probably, if there are any anthropologists in the audience, they'll probably wince, but I think of myself as being something like an anthropologist in an infinitely loose and sloppy way. I like to watch people use technology that I haven't used at all and see how it changes them. Try to see how it changes them. because if I use it, it will change me. I have no doubt about that. And then I will not be the outsider able to ask the questions.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, I guess more of a literary question. Just want to know sort of what is it about the trilogy? It's a form you keep returning to, and I understand if you don't want to say whether there's going to be a third book in this, the stubs or not, but just sort of what is it about that kind of rhythm of world building or book writing that you keep returning to?
Well, when Lev and I, first met up earlier this evening, he said something like, "Well, I see you've committed another of the trilogies you swear you've never intended."
That's not a direct quote, but
No, I'm paraphrasing. And his tone was not really accusatory, but I never ever intended. I never intended Neuromancer to be the first book in a trilogy. I was totally allergic to the whole idea of trilogies because I saw it as part of what had turned science fiction into what I saw in the early 80s as like a version of Nashville. Compared to the actual country music of my early teens, like it seemed like, and it was all trilogies and quadrilogies and umpty volume mega novels and things, and it was totally the opposite of what I wanted to do. So I got to the end of Neuromancer. It actually had been turned in, accepted. They sent me back the proofs to correct. I read through the proofs. And on the very last page, I added the book's very last lines, and he never saw Molly again. That's the end of the book. And so I thought, okay, that's the end of the trilogy, man. If those two can't get together, it can't happen. But, life happens. And I actually tried writing another novel, which I won't describe, that was utterly nothing at all, like Neuromancer. I hadn't really started it, but something messed up with the person who was going to publish, the company who was going to publish it, and that was that was it. But I realized I was already in this thing where I needed another book, so. It wound up being Count Zero, and I sort of hoped that my third novel would be something different, and it wasn't. And then I wrote Virtual Light, thinking it was this is a one-off for sure, and it wasn't. And it's always been like it doesn't appeal to me. It doesn't appeal to me, but I don't, I'm coming to accept that maybe I just don't have it in me to write, to get a universe, a fictive universe up and running, which is a lot of work, and then go to another book and get a different one up and running, and in the meantime, I start to wonder about what other things could be going on in that universe. But I've been laughing at myself since before I began the Peripheral, and here I am swearing to myself and everybody else that this won't be a trilogy, and it just seems like part of the process. Maybe part of the process is that I have to pretend it's not going to be part of a trilogy. It's like Robert Sheckley, a wonderful man and my very first professional editor. He was my editor at Omni Magazine before Alan Datlow, who was his assistant then, took over his job. He took me out for lunch, and sort of my first time as a grown-up in New York, and this writer I really admired took me out to lunch, and I said, "Can you give me any advice?" And he said, "Never sign a multi-book contract, and don't buy that old house." And the first, I've held to, not the second, but the first I've held to, and I think it would feel to me, if I admitted to myself that I was, starting to write another trilogy, it would feel kind of like signing the multi-book contract. Like I like to feel like I could walk on these people, I could just I could leave these characters here. I could invent some other prettier people. It's like, but maybe I should just kind of learn to admit that it's not going to happen.
I'm sorry, I think we have time for one more.
Well, I'm happy to be the last then. I love a lot of your books, love the Bridge books, I love Spook Country, but I want to ask you about the Difference Engine, just because it's so different and it's a one-off, and it was with Bruce Sterling, who I think is brilliant and I love. So I guess what I'm asking is, could you comment on how it was to collaborate writing another book, and how was it writing about not the present or the future, but writing about the past?
Oh, it was that was an amazing experience. Really, really a remarkable experience. I think I got into it because, in some perverse way, because I thought, Bruce, it came up. Well, Bruce had discovered Charles Babbage, and he was telling me all this Babbage stuff, and I'm going, wow, this would make an awesome story. You should do a science fiction story with this guy. And he looked at me and he said, "You write it." I said, "No way, you write it. You're the one who found all this stuff." And somehow that segued into, we're both writing it. But once we wrote it over fax. We wrote it sending faxes back and forth, and then it became FedExing CD-ROMs, and it was like neither of us had. We had computers, but I didn't. Maybe Bruce had some, primitive internet connection, but I didn't. And I don't know if you could even send documents that size in those days. But what it came to feel like for me, really profoundly feel like for me, and it was just a weird feeling every day, is that neither Bruce nor I personally knew nor had direct access to the book's author. The book's author was in another room of some kind, dictating this really weird work, which I didn't fully understand, but I knew how to do my part. Like I would get a chapter from Bruce, and I would go over it and do my thing with it and send it back to him, and he would adjust it. And it's like, it was a very, very thorough collaboration. But it reminded me very much of William Burroughs talking. William Burroughs was fascinated by the mechanism of literary collaboration. And he talked about the third man, sort of the voice in the other room, who was some kind of combination of two talents going full on as best they could. And it really felt like that. And I know when the ending of it, Bruce just sent it up, and I just said, that's the end of it. There's nothing I can do. You got to the end. And he said, yeah, we did. And I thought, I've never really asked him about it, but I think he was having the same experience too. It's like, he sent me the last page and that third guy left, never to be heard from again.